So in one of his first published works on population ethics, Derek Parfit observed that most of us think there's nothing wrong in not having children, even if they would have been very happy, but we think that having children who are bound to suffer is wrong. Now, on one view, that's true, but only because of what procreation is like for parents. So obviously, having children has significant costs. It transforms our lives and relationships and gives us new values and responsibilities. So it's sort of no wonder that for those reasons, potential parents should have some sort of moral prerogative to determine whether they have children, and if so, how many they have. But some of us think this observation goes deeper than that. We think that even if we wouldn't be morally required to create a bunch of happy people even by, say, just pressing a button to populate some distant planet with a bunch of wonderful lives, or to create a bunch of happy animals by pumping pheromones into a lab or natural ecosystem. And we think that if we wouldn't be morally required to adopt some policy on the basis of its effects on independently existing people, that we wouldn't suddenly become morally required if we learned that that policy would cause a bunch more happy people to exist. So those of us who think those things accept some version of what's called the procreation asymmetry, which I'll understand as the claim that at least when other things are equal, for example, the effects on existing people, it's morally permissible but not required to create people with good lives, but it's wrong to create people with bad lives. Now, this purported asymmetry is important for both theoretical and practical reasons. So a theoretical reason is that it seems to be a commitment of broadly relational theories of moral obligation to which some philosophers are attracted, on which moral obligations are fundamentally owed to other people. So on that kind of view, it's hard to see how we could have a moral obligation to create people, because if we flout that obligation, there's no one to whom we owed it, there's no one who's wronged. On a more practical level, the asymmetry has been thought to be relevant to arguments for the importance of reducing the risk of human extinction. And arguments of this kind, particularly arguments appealing to the value of happy people. So arguments of this kind appear in the closing exhortations of all of Parfit's books. So Parfit believed that reducing existential risk should be, as he put it, what now matters most. And one reason for that, which many philosophers and people in the effective altruism community have further developed, is the vast number of future people who would be deprived of potentially worthwhile lives if humanity went extinct. So it's often thought that if the procreation asymmetry is true, this sort of argument for the importance of reducing existential risk can't get off the ground. And some have even suggested that if the asymmetry is true, then extinction might even be a good thing. So the general thinking, at least, seems to be that whether or not the procreation asymmetry is true can make a potentially enormous difference to global priority setting, but I'm going to come back to that issue at the end of the talk. So it's important to distinguish the procreation asymmetry, as I've defined it, from a related claim in population axiology, having to do with goodness, which John Broome calls the intuition of neutrality. So this is the idea that adding a person to the world, at least within a certain neutral range, makes the world neither better nor worse. So it's in that sense neutral. And if the neutral range goes all the way up, so that adding happy people never makes the world better, but adding people below the neutral range with bad lives makes things worse, that's a kind of axiological analog of the procreation asymmetry. Now, Broome argues that we should reject the intuition of neutrality, and I agree. But it seems to me that the strong version of the intuition that I just mentioned, where the neutral range goes all the way up, seems to me that that's not very widely shared. So if we learn that the world contained many, many more wonderful lives than we thought, it seems to me that would be good news, not a merely neutral thing. So, but while I reject the intuition of neutrality, I'm strongly attracted to the procreation asymmetry, and I think, or at least hope, we can have the asymmetry without the intuition of neutrality. Now, this might seem to be a kind of unstable combination of views, and here's a quick argument to that effect. Let's assume that it's good to create happy people, contrary to the intuition of neutrality. Well, if it's good to create happy people, then surely we have some moral reason to create them. And at least when other things are equal, so for example, there's nothing bad about their lives or they have no negative effects on other people, we'd have no reason not to create those people. And if we have some reason to do something and we have no reason not to do it, then it seems like we ought to do it. That seems a no-brainer. So it seems like we ought to create happy people at least when other things are equal, and therefore the procreation asymmetry must be false. So there are various possible responses to this argument, but the one I favor is to say that actually it's pretty good up until the very last step. We do have moral reason to create happy people. Indeed, sometimes we ought to, but it doesn't follow from this that we're morally required to create happy people. So following many linguists and philosophers, there's an important difference between saying that we should or ought to do something even for moral reasons and saying that we're morally required to do it so that failing to do it would be wrong. So should and ought are what are often called weak necessity modals. Must, have to, required, and so on are called strong necessity modals. So to illustrate the weakness versus the strength, it seems perfectly consistent to say that you ought to wash the dishes, but you don't have to, or that employees must wash hands, but really everyone should. And there are various accounts of the exact semantic difference between weak and strong necessity modals, but one feature that a lot of accounts share is that the weak necessity modals, should and ought, are related in some way to maximizing some relation. So if one of your options is better than all of the others, then it seems like that's the option you should take. Or as philosophers like to say, if you have more reason to choose this option than you have to choose any of the others, then that's what you have most reason to choose, and therefore what you ought to choose. By contrast, it doesn't seem to follow from the fact that this option is better than all of the others that you're morally required to take that option, so that failing to take it would be wrong. So for the most part, it's okay if you don't agree with that precise difference or even with the general distinction here. You'll still be able to understand and even agree with many of the things I'll say in the talk, but I will come back to that this difference in that claim towards the end, as long as you have some other way of responding to the argument on the previous slide and thus reconciling the procreation asymmetry, the optionality of creating happy people with the goodness of creating happy people, and thus the rejection of the intuition of neutrality. So I think we can have the asymmetry without the intuition of neutrality, but as we'll see today, the asymmetry is nonetheless inconsistent with other plausible, purely deontic principles, principles just about what's morally permitted or required. So an argument can be mounted against the asymmetry from those principles that doesn't appeal to the goodness of creating happy people as a premise and doesn't assume that we're just morally required to bring about, to do what's best. So in my view, that argument is not decisive. I don't think the puzzles are fatal for the asymmetry, and but I think the puzzles are nonetheless helpful for identifying some choice points for developing a moral theory that incorporates the asymmetry, and I'm going to use them to motivate a kind of view that is not only consistent with the goodness of creating happy people and so doesn't rely on the intuition of neutrality, but which actually appeals to that goodness in resolving the puzzles. So if that kind of solution is attractive, then it gives reasons for other proponents of the asymmetry to join me in rejecting the intuition of neutrality, and that can make a difference to the practical implications of our view. So the puzzles I'm going to discuss are based on and inspired by Parfit's mere addition paradox in population axiology. But there are a few important differences between the puzzles I'll discuss and Parfit's paradox, as well as related impossibility results in the literature. So first, they're not going to involve any sort of repugnant conclusion involving vast populations of lives that are barely worth living. Nothing like that is going on. Second, because of that, we're going to have to appeal to only quite minimal assumptions about the structure of welfare. We're not going to assume that there's any numerical representation of welfare, though I'll sometimes use numbers for illustration, or other controversial structural claims about what welfare is like. But most importantly, the puzzles we'll discuss, the principles are just about what's permissible or required, no axiological claims about what's better or worse. And that's important both because some philosophers have raised doubts about the notion of overall goodness or betterness that's at play in population axiology. And second, because it's at least controversial whether our deontic notions of permissibility or requirement are subject to the same kinds of structural constraints that are thought to apply to betterness, in particular transitivity, and I'll talk about that a bit more later on. But overall, a theme of the results that we'll talk about today is just to further demonstrate how incredibly philosophically fertile Parfit's paradox still is many decades after it was formulated and for purposes other than that to which he put it. Okay, so before we get into the puzzles, just very quickly, I want to lay out the framework or setup in which the principles will be formulated. So I'm going to understand a population as a set of people. And I'm going to further assume that if you have any two populations, you can form a third population by taking their union, the set of people who are in either one. And that's all we're going to assume about populations. A welfare level is supposed to capture how good a person's life is, or how good an outcome is or could be for that person. And we're going to assume that some welfare levels are greater than others, and on the handout in the slides, that'll be written with a greater than symbol, but that's all we assume about welfare levels. A welfare distribution is a function that maps the members of maps each member of some population to a welfare level. So we say here's a population, a set of people, and the welfare distribution tells us how well off each member of that population is or could be. That's what a welfare distribution is. A bit of notation that we'll use a lot in formulating the principles. If you have any population n and any welfare level c, this bold c sub n denotes the constant or perfectly equal distribution that maps each member of population n to welfare level c. So this means all the n people have welfare c. Now I'm going to think about our moral theory as telling us which of our options in any situation are permissible or not. So I'll call the options that we might face a menu. And I'm going to think about the options as just being individuated by the welfare distributions they bring about. So every set, non-empty set of welfare distributions, I'll call a menu. And I want to know which distributions it's permissible to choose from any such menu. And I'm going to assume throughout the talk that on each menu, there's at least one permissible option. There may well be more than one, but there aren't zero. So there are no hard moral dilemmas here where none of our options is morally permissible. Finally, in individuating our objects of choice as by the welfare distributions they bring about, I'm implicitly assuming a kind of welfarism, that the only morally relevant considerations in the choices at issue are their effects on people's well-being. And I make that assumption not because I think it's like a true general principle about all of morality in general, I don't, but rather to kind of simplify and focus our attention on this one morally relevant consideration, people's welfare. I assume that there are some choices, including choices that affect how many people will exist, that are constrained by certain principles purely on the basis of those choices' effects on people's welfare. Perhaps the procreation asymmetry is one of them, and I want to study those choices. So I'm not trying to assume that there are no other morally relevant principles. Okay. Now we're going to get into our first puzzle, and it's going to be sort of a warm-up to the others, and that'll involve purely binary choices between two distributions at a time. And then we'll see after that how to generalize this strategy to apply, and these principles to apply to arbitrary menus of options. So our first principle will concern what we'll call constant addition, which is when you take a perfectly equal distribution, a constant distribution, and you add more people to that same distribution at that same level. So you've expanded this constant distribution, and anyone who accepts the asymmetry is going to think you're not morally required to do that. So our binary constant addition principle will say that for any welfare level, say B, and disjoint populations, that is non-overlapping populations M and N, we're not morally required to choose a distribution where all the M people and all the N people are at level B, when the only alternative is a distribution where all the M people are at level B and the N people don't exist. So for example, in a binary choice between this small distribution where Anne is at level 80, again, the numbers are just for illustration. You could think about that as her number of years of happy life or something, and the Bobs don't exist, and this equal big distribution where Anne and some possibly large number of Bobs exist at that same welfare level, we're not required to choose equal big. And small is highlighted in green to indicate that it's permissible. We haven't highlighted equal big in any color because our principle doesn't say whether it's permissible or not. Intuitively, it should be, but the principle just says it's okay to choose small here. And anyone who accepts the asymmetry is going to accept that. Our second binary principle will concern what's sometimes called benign addition. Gustav Arrhenius calls it dominance addition, which is when you add a bunch of happy people to the world, sufficiently happy people to the world, in a way that makes existing people better off. So our binary benign addition principle says that in a binary choice, benign addition is morally required. So if you face a binary choice between this small distribution where Ann's at level 80 and an unequal big distribution where Ann's made better off at level 85 and there are a bunch of Bobs whose lives are sufficiently good at, say, level 70. If that's not sufficiently good, we can make it higher. Binary benign addition says we're morally required to choose unequal big. And the motivation for this condition is that while we may not be morally required to make happy people, we do seem required to make people happy, at least when the cost to ourselves is sufficiently low, including 0. So we have some duty of beneficence. So if we owe such a duty to Anne because we can make her better off, and the only further effect is that we'd be, in fulfilling that duty, creating a bunch of sufficiently happy people, well, that further effect, it seems, shouldn't cancel out or undermine or swallow up our duty to make Anne better off. And so if we were required, we'd be required to benefit Anne if there were none of these Bobs. We're still required when benefiting Anne requires creating a bunch of Bobs. That's the motivation for our binary benign addition condition. Our third condition is a fixed population condition, which we'll call non-elitism. It says basically that we're sometimes required to choose an equal distribution when the only alternative is an unequal distribution that's perhaps slightly better for some, but perhaps much worse for many others. So suppose we have to choose a distribution in which some people are at a higher level A, say Anne at 85, and others are at a lower level C, say the Bobs at 70, and another distribution in which all those people are equally well off at some middle level B, say 80. Binary non-elitism claims that for any specification of the lower level, we can find some higher levels and some numbers of people at these levels such that you're required to choose the equal distribution. You're required to choose equal big when the only alternative is unequal big. And the claim is, well, if that's not true for these particular distributions, you can find some other ones for which it'll do, given any specification of this lowest level. And this is supposed to be a kind of minimal requirement of distributive justice. Now, those three binary principles are by themselves perfectly consistent, but they become inconsistent if we appeal to some further so-called consistency conditions on moral permissibility. So the first of these is what Sen calls property alpha. It's a condition of contraction consistency with respect to permissibility. So alpha says that if an option is permissible in some menu, then it's also permissible in any subset of that menu to which it belongs. Or equivalently, if it's impermissible on some menu, then it's also impermissible in any expansion of that menu. So for example, if X is permissible in this menu T, and that's why it's green, then X is also permissible in any submenu S of T to which X belongs. So the slogan here is you can't make a right wrong by removing options, or equivalently, you can't make a wrong right just by adding options. That's the idea behind alpha, or contraction consistency. And then finally, our other consistency condition will be what Sen calls property delta. It's an expansion consistency condition, so given it this other label, expansion non-uniqueness. It says that if two options are both permissible on some menu, so for example, X and Y are both permissible in this menu S, then neither of them is required as in the only permissible option in any expansion of that menu. So this situation where X is the only permissible option in this expanded menu T, that's ruled out according to delta, given that X and Y are both permissible in the smaller menu S. So it's compatible with delta that one of X but not Y, one of X and Y, say X but not Y, is permissible in the expanded menu, but in that case there must be some other option that's permissible. You can't make X the only permissible option by adding some other options that are impermissible. So if some choice would be morally optional, permitted but not required in some menu, you can't turn it into an obligation or requirement by adding other alternatives that are wrong, that are impermissible. That's property delta. And our first puzzle is that the three binary principles are inconsistent given alpha and delta, and we'll illustrate the proof using the three distributions that I've been using as an example. If you don't like those distributions, according to the principles, we can imagine some other ones for which they work. So first, we consider a binary choice between the small distribution and the unequal big distribution. And our benign addition principle said that it's wrong to choose small when the only alternative is unequal big, because you're morally required to benefit Anne here when the only further effect is creating a bunch of Bobs. So in that binary choice, small is impermissible. So by property alpha, contraction consistency, it remains impermissible in the 3-option menu when all 3 of these distributions are available. Because if small was permissible in the 3-option menu, it would be permissible by alpha in a binary choice with any other alternative. So small is impermissible when you have all 3 options. Then consider a binary choice between the unequal big distribution and the equal big distribution. Well, by our non-elitism condition, our distributive justice requirement, it seems wrong to choose unequal big when the only alternative is equal big. So by property alpha, unequal big is also impermissible in the 3-option menu. If it were permissible in the 3-option menu, then it would be permissible in a binary choice with equal big. So we've eliminated as impermissible these first 2 distributions when all 3 options are available. So the only permissible option, what we're required to choose when all 3 options are on the menu, is equal big by those principles. But now by property alpha, equal big must remain permissible in a binary choice when the only alternative is small, let's say. But small and equal big just differ by constant addition. So small is also permissible by our constant addition condition, which seems a commitment of the asymmetry. So both small and equal big by our principles are permissible in a binary choice. So by property delta, neither of them can be required, the only permissible option in an expanded menu, but we just saw that by the other principles, equal big is required. It's the only permissible choice in the 3-option menu, so we have a contradiction. So one of these principles has to go. Now, if you're like me, the binary principles look pretty good, and so we might further scrutinize these so-called consistency conditions, alpha and delta. And one reason they merit further scrutiny is that they together have the very strong consequence that binary requirement must choose rather than is transitive. So if you're required to choose X when the only alternative is Y, and you're required to choose Y when the only alternative is Z, then you're required to choose X when the only alternative is Z. That follows from alpha and delta by reasoning that's quite similar to what we used in proving observation 1. So while this seems like a very natural principle, there are at least cases where it has controversial implications. So here's one due to Leo Katz, which we'll call the triage case. So suppose we're working in an emergency room and 2 patients, Al and Chloe, come in. They've been in a car accident, and Al is in danger of losing both his legs. Chloe's in danger of losing her index finger. Suppose we can only help one of them. Well, ordinarily, of course, we'd be required to help Al and save his legs rather than Chloe's index finger. But suppose that Al and Chloe are married, and Chloe is a passionate amateur pianist. So it's enormously important to her, and therefore also to Al, that she have full use of her index finger. So that Al himself, let's say, sincerely prefers that we help Chloe and save her finger rather than his legs. Well, in that case, we might think it's at least permissible to save Chloe's index finger rather than saving Al's legs. But now suppose that a third patient, B, comes in, and she's in danger of losing just one of her legs. Well, in a choice between saving B's leg and Chloe's index finger, surely required to save B's leg. In a choice between saving both of Al's legs and one of B's legs, we seem required to save both of Al's. But by transitivity, we'd be required to save both of Al's legs rather than Chloe's index finger in a binary choice. But we just saw that, well, maybe it's permissible to save Chloe's index finger instead, given the facts about their relationship. So these intuitive judgments about this case are, at least on the face of it, inconsistent with the transitivity of binary requirement, and thus with the conjunction of alpha and delta. So we might respond to this by saying, well, we can just reject alpha or delta. That gets us out of this puzzle, so we're home free and we can have the asymmetry, and as well as all the other binary principles. But that's not going to be enough to preserve the asymmetry, and that's because we can reformulate our binary conditions into global conditions concerning choice from arbitrary menus of options in such a way that they remain, I think, independently plausible, but also nonetheless inconsistent, even in the absence of alpha or delta or any other consistency conditions. And this is following a strategy that was first suggested in social choice theory by Amartya Sen and has been pioneered in population ethics by Gustav Arrhenius. So now we're going to get into a global analog of that first puzzle. So the binary principles are now going to become global principles. So our constant addition principle, and I'm just dropping the binary to suggest that now we're talking about arbitrary menus, will say that if you can bring about a distribution in which some people are at some level of well-being, say the small distribution where Anne's at 80, we're not required to instead choose a distribution in which those same people plus some others are at that same level of well-being, no matter what other options are on the menu. So the asterisks here indicate that there may be other options on the menu, and the principle says, look, if small is on the menu, you're not required to choose equal big. That's not the only permissible option, no matter what else is on the menu. That's our constant addition principle, the global version. Our global benign addition principle, instead of saying that benign addition is required, our principle will say instead that it's, as I'll put it, conditionally permissible. So roughly it'll say that if it's okay to choose some distribution, then it's okay to choose any distribution related to it by benign addition. That is, adding happy people in a way that makes existing people better off. So our global benign addition principle says that if it's okay for us to choose a distribution like small here, in which Anne's at level 80, and it's possible for us to instead choose a distribution like unequal big, where Anne would be better off and there'd be a bunch of Bobs, then it's okay for us to choose unequal big too. And again, that's supposed to apply no matter what other options are on the menu. So the intuition behind this principle is similar to that behind the binary benign addition principle. It's, well, how could it be permissible to choose small when unequal big is on the menu? How could it be okay to leave Anne hanging and do what's worse for her, for every member of her population, when we could instead make her better off at the only further cost of creating a bunch of happy people? Intuitively, it's not permissible. But if for some reason, due to possibly other options on the menu, it were okay to choose small, then it must also be okay to choose unequal big, which seems clearly superior to small. That's the motivation behind the global benign addition condition. And our global non-elitism condition will say that basically sometimes it's wrong to choose an unequal distribution in the presence of a sufficiently good equal distribution, again, no matter what other options are on the menu. It's wrong to choose, say, unequal big if equal big is on the menu, again, no matter what other distributions are available. That's our global non-elitism condition. And our second puzzle, it's just the global analog of the first, is that those three conditions, constant addition, benign addition, and non-elitism, the global versions, are inconsistent. And again, there's no alpha or delta going on here. And the argument for this is going to be illustrated, again, using these three distributions. So we're just going to consider a three-option choice between those three distributions. First, we note that by our non-elitism condition, it's wrong to choose unequal big from any menu that has equal big. So it's wrong to choose unequal big here. Well, our benign addition principle said that if it was okay to choose small, then it would be okay to choose unequal big. But we just saw it's not okay to choose unequal big, so it's not okay to choose small. So those two distributions are impermissible on the three-option menu. So the only permissible option, what we're required to choose, is this equal big distribution. But that violates our constant addition principle. It seems like if that were true, we would be required to create some happy people. That seems at odds with the asymmetry. So the lesson that I draw from this puzzle, and more generally the exercise of kind of globalizing the conditions to apply to arbitrary menus, is that it's not enough for the proponent of the asymmetry to just reject alpha or delta. We also have to identify which of these global principles fails and why. Okay. So we might wonder at this point whether we can solve the puzzles introduced so far by just taking some solution to the mere addition paradox in population axiology off the shelf and applying it here. So I want to look in particular to test that strategy on an idea that Parfit himself suggested in response to his paradox. So Parfit suggested in response to his paradox an appeal to what he called perfectionist values. He suggested that even if some change brings a net benefit to those who are affected, it's a change for the worse if it involved the loss of one of the best things in life. And in later work, he appealed to a similar claim, suggesting that we might have to appeal to something like this or a weakening of it in order to avoid the repugnant conclusion. Now, it was important for Parfit to distinguish between having more of the best things in life and raising the welfare of the best off people, but to kind of clearly make it applicable here, we're just going to operationalize the view as though it applies in that way, that the distribution with that raises the maximum welfare level, where the best off are as well off as possible, that's the distribution that has more of the best things in life, or is better in perfectionist terms. So we could consider a deontic analog of this appeal to perfection, but a view that says we're morally required to choose whatever's the best for the, whatever brings about more of the best things in life, understood as raising the maximum welfare level, that's just going to be inconsistent with the asymmetry, because it'll say we're morally required to create happy people when doing so brings about more of the best things in life. But we could consider a kind of permissive version that is consistent with the asymmetry, but nonetheless is inconsistent with some of the principles from our earlier puzzles. So we could imagine a view that says, look, you're morally required to choose any distribution that maximizes the amount of, or you're morally permitted, but not necessarily required to choose any distribution that's optimal in perfectionist terms by maximizing the amount of the best things in life, understood here as the welfare of the best off. And that'll be consistent with the asymmetry, but it'll violate the non-elitism condition. So in short, Parfit might respond, or someone who likes this solution might respond to these first puzzles by saying, let's reject the non-elitism condition because we need to appeal to perfectionism anyway in order to avoid the repugnant conclusion. That's the ideal. But that's not going to really help very much in this context because we can get another puzzle for the asymmetry involving principles that are consistent with a permission to choose whatever distribution is best in perfectionist terms. So we're going to illustrate that by replacing our fixed population condition, the non-elitism condition, with what I'll call number counting, which just says that basically sometimes it's wrong to benefit the few when you could instead benefit the many. So if you can choose a distribution in which a smaller number of people are at a lower level, B, say 80, and at 80, and a larger number at some higher level, A, say all the Bobs at 90, if we could choose this better for many distribution, then it's not permissible for us to instead choose a distribution in which the larger number, all the Bobs, are at the lower level, and the smaller number, just Ann, is at the higher level. So the claim is for any lower level here, you can specify a higher level and some numbers of people at this level, such that it's wrong to make the few better off when you can instead make the better off. So this principle, and again, this is supposed to be true no matter what other alternatives are on the menu. You can't choose better for one when better for many is on the menu. That's perfectly consistent with perfectionism, as well as lots of other views about distribution and inequality and the best off and the worst off and so on. Next, we'll weaken our benign addition principle to concern what I'll call very benign addition, which will be when we make existing people better off and add some happy people at the same welfare level that the existing people previously were. So for example, this kind of benign addition always raises the average welfare, and it never lowers the minimum welfare, for example, if we were concerned with those features of distributions. So very benign addition will say that if it's okay for us to choose a distribution like small here, where Ann's at 80, and we can instead choose a distribution where Ann would be better off, and all the Bobs would exist at the same welfare level that Ann originally was. Well, if it was okay for us to choose small, then it's okay for us to choose better for one, no matter what other options are on the menu. And the intuition here is, again, similar to that in favor of the original benign addition principle. How could it be okay to choose small and to do what's worse for Ann, her entire population, when we could instead make her better off only by adding a bunch of people who would be just as well off as Ann originally would? It doesn't seem permissible, but if for whatever reason it is, it should be okay to choose this superior distribution instead. And we'll replace our constant addition principle with a mere addition principle. So mere addition is when you just add people to the population without affecting anyone else, and our mere addition principle says mere addition is not required. We're not required to choose a distribution that relates to another on the menu by mere addition. So if we can choose a distribution like small on our menu, then we're not required to instead choose better for many, no matter what else is on the menu, because better for many relates to small by mere addition. You just add a bunch of happy Bobs. And again, it seems like proponents of the asymmetry should want to accept that. Otherwise, they think we're morally required to add happy people, at least if they're Bobs. So our third puzzle is that those three principles are consistent, mere addition, very benign addition, and number counting. And the reasoning is quite similar to that behind the second puzzle. If it's okay to choose small, then it's okay to choose better for one by very benign addition. It's not okay to choose better for one because of better for many, because of the presence of better for many. That follows from number counting, supposing these distributions satisfy the relevant principles. So it's not okay to choose better for one, so it's not okay to choose small either by very benign addition. So we're morally required to choose better for many, but that relates to small by mere addition. So we're required to engage in mere addition, and that seems at odds with the asymmetry. Now, I said that it seems at odds with the asymmetry, but we should be careful because while I said that the binary constant addition, and this applies similarly to the binary restriction of the mere addition condition, that's a non-negotiable commitment of the asymmetry. Maybe not so much for what I'm calling the global version. So you could think that, say, you're required to choose better for many when all three options are on the menu, but in a binary choice between small and better for many, when it's just mere addition or not mere addition, we're not required to do that. So you're not required to create happy people in a binary choice, but maybe when there are some other options, maybe you can be. So that type of view is it's going to violate the global mere addition and constant addition conditions, but satisfy the restriction to binary menus, and it'll in general violate property delta, because it'll say, the expansion condition, because it'll say, yeah, you can choose either small or better for many in a binary choice, but when you add some further options, which are not themselves permissible, you're required to choose better for many. But delta was maybe the kind of least familiar principle involved in our first puzzle, so we might think that kind of presses on a kind of weak point in that first puzzle. And an important recent paper on the asymmetry, Teru Thomas explores views that have this structure. But while I think that view has a number of attractive features, it seems to me that the kind of optionality it offers with respect to creating happy people is too fragile. So our intuition in favor of the asymmetry was that we're not morally required to create happy people, but on this delta denying view that we're considering, we can be morally required to create happy people, at least if you have the option to create them in a way that benefits others, like in this case. But we're not morally required or even permitted to create those people in this beneficial to others way. That's wrong on this view. Instead, we're required to create the happy people in a way that doesn't benefit anyone. And in addition to seeming just kind of counterintuitive, that seems to me at odds with the spirit of the asymmetry. And I think it's especially counterintuitive in cases of what we'll call malign addition, which is when you create happy people in a way that makes existing people worse off. So our malign addition principle says, look, we're not morally required to choose a distribution that relates to another that we could bring about by malign addition. We're not required to make existing people worse off and add happy people. So if it's possible for us to bring about a distribution like small here, well, we're not required to instead choose malign big, where Anne would be made worse off and you to add all the Bobs at some level of well-being, no matter what other options are on the menu. The thought being, if you accept the asymmetry, it's quite strange to think that we can be required to make all existing people worse off in order to add other sufficiently happy people, even if there are other options. And our fourth puzzle, which is kind of just a variation on the third, is that malign addition condition is inconsistent with benign addition and number counting. So the reasoning is familiar. So we consider these three distributions: small, where Anne's at 80, benign big, where Anne's better off and you add all the Bobs here at 70, and malign big, where Anne is worse off at 70 and all the Bobs instead are at 90. Well, if it's okay to choose small, then it's okay to choose benign big by our benign addition condition, but it's not okay to choose benign big in the presence of malign big by our number counting condition. So it's not okay to choose small either. So the only permissible option is malign big. We're morally required to make existing people worse off and add some new happy people. Now, maybe it turns out that the best option for proponents of the asymmetry is to say that, yeah, malign addition can sometimes be morally required. But as I said, that seems to me quite at odds with the spirit of the asymmetry, at least to an extent that if that were the best option, I'm not sure that I would want to accept the asymmetry after all. I'm going to consider one more suggestion in response to these puzzles, the ones we have so far, which we can get by looking at this very first case in Table 1. So one view, and this view is inspired by a recent paper by Johann Frick on the mere addition paradox. So Frick suggests that the inequality in this unequal big distribution is important here, but that inequality is only unjust when all three options are available in the presence of equal big. It's in a binary choice between the small distribution and the unequal big distribution. that inequality is no longer unjust because the Bobs couldn't even be made better off. So as Parfit puts it, why should we regard the Bobs as a blot on the universe? A Bob on the universe. Frick suggests that the inequality is unjust in unequal big, but it's not unjust in a binary choice. And we might think that maybe that objection to unequal big kind of like knocks it out from the three option choice so that it becomes somehow permissible to choose small when all three options are available, even though it wouldn't be permissible to choose small when the only alternative is unequal big, because then the inequality wouldn't be unjust. So it's like this alternative is no longer superior to small in that way. So that type of view is going to violate our global benign addition conditions, but it's going to satisfy the restriction to binary distributions, and for that reason it'll violate our contraction consistency property alpha, but it has a very natural explanation for the violation of alpha, namely the sensitivity of egalitarian injustice to the presence or absence of alternatives in which the worse off people could be made better off. Again, I think that type of view has a number of attractive features, and I do think it presses on the right principles involved in our puzzles, but I think the explanation appealing to egalitarian justice isn't general enough to help the asymmetry, and that's basically due to an insight due to Tommy Francis and Teru Thomas. So this next puzzle builds on their work. So the reason it's not general enough is because we can get a problem for the asymmetry involving cases of benign addition that don't introduce inequality, and we'll call that type of thing egalitarian addition. So egalitarian addition is when you make existing people better off and you add a bunch of happy people who are just as well off as those existing people become. So egalitarian addition will replace our benign addition principles in this puzzle, and it says if it's okay to choose a distribution like small here, and this is true for some welfare level, if it's okay to choose a distribution like small, in which Ann's at 0, let's say, then it's okay to choose equal big, where Ann's better off, and you add a bunch of happy Bobs that are just as well off as Ann. So the thought here is this principle is supported by whatever intuitions favor the earlier benign addition principles, but it's not impugned by any considerations having to do with inequality because, well, both these distributions are perfectly equal. So any explanation appealing to egalitarian injustice can't tell us that we ought to reject egalitarian addition. If it's false, there must be some other explanation. And the fixed population condition for this puzzle, we'll call it non-extreme priority. It says that there are limits to whatever priority we might give to the worse off. So just as our non-elitism condition said that it can sometimes be wrong to choose an unequal distribution in the presence of an equally distributed alternative, our non-elitism condition, or our non-extreme priority condition, will say that it's sometimes wrong to choose an equal distribution in the presence of an unequal distribution that's sufficiently better for the better off. So for any welfare level C, say 0, there are higher ones, say 1 in 100, and some people, maybe Ann and all these Bobs here, such that it's wrong to put all those people at level 1 when we could instead put just one of them at 0, say Ann, and all the others at 100. So it's wrong to choose equal big in the presence of unequal big. And the thought here is that if you violate this principle, then it's like you give extreme priority to the worse off, perhaps because you give absolute priority. Sometimes the interests of, say, Ann here have to give way to the vastly more significant interests in terms of magnitude of the Bobs, a number. And our fifth and final puzzle is that mere addition, egalitarian addition, and non-extreme priority are inconsistent, and the reasoning by now is familiar. So using these three principles, if it's okay to choose small, it's okay to choose equal big by egalitarian addition, but it's not okay to choose equal big in the presence of unequal big by non-extreme priority. So it's not okay to choose small, so we're required to choose unequal big, which relates to small by mere addition. So we're required to add happy people. That seems at odds with the asymmetry. So the lesson of this last puzzle is that this kind of egalitarian solution only seems to help with this puzzle if we give it so much weight to equality as to reject the non-extreme priority condition, for example, by giving absolute priority to the worse off. Now, maybe that turns out to ultimately be the best way of going, but it seems to me too extreme, and it seems to me especially surprising that maintaining the asymmetry in population ethics should require anything like that kind of attitude towards distributive equality, because the intuitions behind the asymmetry, we're not required to create happy people, don't seem to have anything to do with distributive equality. So it's strange to think that in order to maintain the one, you need a commitment, such an extreme kind of commitment to the other. So I want to look elsewhere for a solution. So I now want to take a step back. I think that in order to resolve these puzzles, we need to first ask, well, why is the asymmetry supposed to be true if it is? And the hope, at least, is that whatever the underlying explanation is of the asymmetry can help us choose between different possible solutions to our puzzle. And I'm going to work with a particularly simple explanation of the asymmetry, the idea that wrongs require victims. That an act is wrong only if it wrongs someone. So if you create someone with a bad life, what you've done is wrong, and you've wronged that person, the one you create. If you fail to create someone with a good life, then there's no person that you've wronged there. So that's a very simple explanation of the asymmetry. It's also very controversial. Some people think it's refuted by Parfit's non-identity problem. So they think it can be wrong to create someone even with a very good life. If you could instead create a different person with an even better life, that would be wrong, but you wouldn't be wronging the person that you create because their life would be good and no worse than it could have been otherwise. I'm not so sure about that. I agree that you ought to create the better life rather than the worse one. Even Parfit tends not to claim that choices like that are wrong. He says that his imagined 14-year-old girl ought to wait to have a child later, that there's some moral reason to ensure that better lives are lived in the future. So I think it's complicated, but I'll just note that there are, at the very least, various responses to the non-identity problem that are, at least in principle, consistent with this very simple idea that wrongs require victims. Some of them would require a departure from this simple welfarist framework, I'm assuming. So I take the idea wrongs require victims to be at least plausible enough to explore as a possible foundation for the asymmetry that we can then see how it sheds light on our puzzles. So that's what I'm going to do. So I think the way in which this type of explanation can help shed light on the puzzles is by, we can ask this further question, well, when is a person wronged by virtue of the effects of our choices on their well-being? I think there are lots of other possible ways in which they can be wronged. But when is someone wronged in that way? Well, I'm going to start by considering a sufficient condition. Let's suppose that a person is made worse off not only than they could have been, but than they should or ought to have been. So the person can say, look, you ought to have chosen this option, and if you had, I'd have been better off. I'm going to suppose that that's sufficient for the person to be wrong. If a person can complain, I'm worse off than they ought to have been, I'll suppose they're wrong. Now, in order to apply that type of condition, we need an account of what you ought to do. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, I think about what you ought to do in terms of which of your options is best or what you have most reason to choose. And I assume that in the choices at issue, where the options are individuated by the welfare distributions they bring about, the best option is just the one with the best welfare distribution. So we need a welfare-based axiology. I'm going to work with a particularly simple one, a total utilitarian axiology, which says that the best distribution is just the one with the greatest sum of well-being. But what matters for my purposes is just that we use an axiology that satisfies minimally plausible fixed population conditions while violating the intuition of neutrality by saying that it's good to create happy people. Total utilitarianism does that, but there are other views that would do that too. So on this view, the best distribution in this case, table 3, is malign big. That has the greatest sum of well-being, so that's what we ought to choose. That's the best distribution. So if you choose benign big, that makes the bobs worse off than they ought to have been, because the best distribution is this one. And so the bobs are wronged if you choose benign big. Similarly, if you have a binary choice between small and benign big, Anne is wronged by a choice of small because she's worse off than you ought to have been. The better distribution is benign big in a binary choice. That's what you ought to choose. But what about when both benign big and malign big are available? Is Anne wronged if you choose small in that case? Well, we might think, well, maybe she is. And you can get that result by kind of extending or broadening our sufficient condition. So we might say, well, maybe a person is wronged if she's made worse off not only than she ought to have been, but if she's worse off than she would have been under some better option. So in that case, the person can say, look, I'm worse. You shouldn't have done what you did. And because there's at least some better option, including one in which I would have been better off. So if that's sufficient to be wronged, then in the 3-option choice, Anne can say Anne is wronged by a choice of small because she's worse off then she would have been under some option that's better, namely benign big. So on this view, Anne is wrong both by small in both a 2-option choice with benign big and a 3-option choice with all 3 distributions. And that's going to lead to a kind of delta denying view about our puzzles that we explored earlier, because the thought will be that in a binary choice between small and malign big, well, you ought to choose malign big according to our assumption that you ought to choose the distribution with the greatest sum of well-being. So it can't be wrong to choose malign big. And similarly, Anne can't be wronged by small, so both small and malign big will be permissible in a binary choice. But when you look at, you expand the menu to include benign big, suddenly Anne is wronged by a choice of small, the Bobs are wronged by benign big, so you're required to choose malign big. So this is a type of view about wronging that gets you the delta denying view that we discussed earlier. But in addition to finding that kind of view implausible for the reasons I already got into, this reasoning seems to me kind of perverse. So suppose that Anne blames us for choosing small. Says, look, why'd you do that? You've wronged me. You made me worse off than I would have been under some better option. Well, what were we supposed to do? I mean, if we had done what was better for her and chosen benign big, that would have wronged the Bobs. Surely she would agree with that. So if she knows that we're not going to wrong anyone, then she knows that if we hadn't chosen small, we would have just chosen malign big, but that would have been worse for her than what we chose. So we might think, look, how can Anne be wronged by a choice that's the best that we could do for her, compatibly with not wronging anyone else? We might think that answers Anne's claim that she's wronged by the choice of small. So instead of broadening the sufficient condition in this way, we might instead appeal to a necessary condition on wronging. So for example, we might think that we might appeal to the type of explanation I just gave, that maybe a person isn't wronged if the only way of making her better off would wrong someone else. And that type of idea has been floated by a number of other authors in recent work in population ethics. And that would avoid the type of result that we just had before. But while that sounds plausible in the abstract, I don't think it's true. So suppose that you can either save both of Fran's legs or George's finger. These are different people than before. Well, clearly you ought to save George's finger, but suppose instead you help neither of them. Well, in that case, I think both Fran and George are wronged. But that's true even though the only thing that would have addressed George's complaint and made him better off would have been to save his finger. But that would have wronged someone else, namely Fran, because you ought to be saving her legs. So I think that here, both Fran and George are wronged, even though the only thing that would way to make George better off would be to wrong someone else, namely Fran. We might think what's going on here is that, well, yeah, maybe George is wronged if you save no one in this case, because there's a sense in which Fran's objection objection to helping George here, doesn't like compete with George's objection or conflict with George's objection to saving no one, because she too would object to saving no one. She too would be wronged if you save no one. So roughly, we might think this is accommodated by a kind of more complicated, unfortunately, necessary condition to the effect that a person isn't wronged if the only way of making her better off would wrong someone else, not wronged by the original choice, where here Fran is wronged by the original choice to save no one. So that's unfortunately a lot more complicated than this simple, plausible sounding idea, but it seems necessary to avoid this kind of problem. So we have a sufficient condition, you're wronged if you're made worse off than you ought to have been. And we have a necessary condition, you're not wronged if the only way of making you better off would wrong someone else, not wronged by what we did. And there's lots of possible views that satisfy those conditions, but I want to lay out one particularly simple one just for concreteness to explore and draw out the implications of that, those types of conditions. So I'm going to continue to assume that we ought to choose the best distribution in the cases at issue, and that's the one with the greatest sum of well-being. So that's total utilitarian axiology and a maximizing ought. I'll say that a person has a complaint against our choosing some distribution rather than another from some menu, if and only if either that first distribution would be worse for her than the second, or she would have a bad life in the first distribution but wouldn't exist in the second. I'll say, and this is purely stipulative, that the complaint is legitimate if and only if the first distribution really is worse for the second than the second. Not just for her, but overall. You shouldn't choose the first distribution in a binary choice when the second is the alternative. Then I'll say that a person is wronged by a choice in some menu, choosing some distribution from some menu, if and only if both of the following are true. First, that person has a legitimate complaint against the chosen distribution rather than some alternative on the menu. And second, any other individual who has a legitimate complaint against that second distribution also has a legitimate complaint against the first. So that's just capturing the kind of necessary condition from the previous slide. And then we'll suppose that a choice is permissible if and only if it wrongs no one. So to draw out the implications for this type of view, on this kind of view, the solution to the puzzles is to reject the global benign addition conditions. So that's benign addition, very benign addition, and egalitarian addition, while accepting their restrictions to binary menus, and that's going to involve rejecting contraction consistency, or condition alpha. So the thought is going to be that when other alternatives are available, it may be wrong to benefit the original people by adding new ones, since doing so may wrong those who are added. Not for any reasons having to do with inequality, but because of the working of these complaints against being worse off than you should have been. So on this view, the Bobs are wronged by this benign big distribution when malign big is available, and is wronged by small when the only alternative is benign big, but she's not wronged by small when malign big is available too, because while she has a, as I'm putting it, legitimate complaint against small in favor of benign big, the Bobs also have a legitimate complaint against benign big, and they don't have one against small. They're not also wronged by the small choice because they wouldn't even be alive in small. So on that view, small is permissible in the 3-option case, but not when the only alternative is benign big, and that's going to violate property alpha. So those are the principles that I'd want to reject. So though I think those are the right principles to reject in order to resolve the puzzles, obviously this simple theory I've just stated is going to face some problems. Some are going to involve, some are going to be due to the violation of alpha, particularly problems involving sequences of choices made over time, and I have thoughts on those problems, but I'm not going to share them in the talk. I'd be happy to discuss them in Q&A. Other problems for the view are going to stem from the appeal to the total utilitarian axiology, or the conditions for when a person is wrong, which, although they look kind of complicated, strike me as in certain ways too simple. So while I don't suppose that this theory that I've just sketched is fully adequate, I hope it demonstrates the possibility of a solution to our puzzles that respects the, or at least one possible motivation, underlying motivation for the asymmetry, while also violating the intuition of neutrality and affirming the goodness of creating happy people. So let's take stock. We started with the idea that the asymmetry remains plausible, even if, as I think, the axiological intuition of neutrality is false. I believe that creating happy people makes the world better, and that we therefore have some moral reason to create happy people, and sometimes indeed we ought to. It doesn't follow from this, I think, that we're morally required to create happy people, but if we want to preserve the asymmetry, it's not going to be enough to just say, well, we're not required to do what's best, because as we've seen, the asymmetry gives rise to purely deontic puzzles that don't appeal directly to any axiological claims having to do with goodness. And it's not enough to resolve those puzzles by rejecting so-called consistency conditions like alpha or delta, because we've seen that we can formulate global versions of the puzzles in which those conditions don't play any role whatsoever. And we need to justify, if we want the asymmetry, the rejection of one or more of those global principles, and I've suggested a particular way of doing that by appealing to principles about the relationship between wronging, value, permissibility, and what we ought to do. Now, if we accept this kind of view that I've sketched, this limits, I think, the practical significance of the asymmetry with respect to what we ought to do. So, on my view, we ought to create happy people, but we don't have to. That view is consistent, I think, with arguments for the overwhelming importance of reducing existential risk of the kind that Parfit concluded each of his books with, and that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So it may still be true that what now matters most, the cause we ought to prioritize, is reducing the risk of human extinction, even if we're not morally required to create happy people. Some proponents, I realize, of the asymmetry might have hoped for a way of resisting those arguments, but to me, it's a virtue of the view that I've suggested that it's compatible with Parfit's conclusion about what matters most. Thank you.